Hi, this is the video for Daf Shevui, Daf Samekh Bet of Masechet Ketubot. I am Joshua Kulp. We have here on this daf the beginning of a cycle of stories that is perhaps the most famous cycle of stories in the entire Bavli, or at least one of the most famous cycle of stories. And that is, of course, the stories of these rabbis who absented themselves from their homes for very long periods of time. We're going to see eventually Rabbi Akiva on the next daf that goes away from home for 24 years. I wanted to make a couple notes. First of all, in general, about how, at least how I look at Agadah in the Talmud, and that's based on scholarship that's occurred over the past, let's say, generation or so. And then a few words particularly about these Agadot. First of all, about Agadah. It used to be, there are a lot of Agadot that I think that everyone can see. It's very hard to accept them as literal truth. Right? These aren't historical stories that somebody was writing, telling what actually happened. And writers in general in the ancient world did not write bland histories explaining exactly what happened. They always had their own point of view. But nevertheless, you can easily distinguish between, let's say, something like rabbinic Agadah with its very fanciful elements and much more historical writers such as Josephus, Theodotus among the Greeks, people who at least aimed to write what they believed to be accurate history. I'm not sure we can even say that with regard to rabbinic stories. So I think that for the most part in the last generation or so, modern scholars have abandoned the issue of whether or not these stories are historically accurate, and for the most part have accepted that they are not historically accurate, at least as descriptions of the lives of the people that they talk about. However, they were written at a certain period of time, and they do reflect the concerns, the anxieties, and perhaps a little bit the historical actions, not of the people they describe in this story, for instance, Rabbi Akiva and other such rabbis, but they describe the lives of the people who were composing them and the target audience, right? They would have been relevant to the target audience. So the issue of going away for such an extended period of time, historically speaking, is probably not something that occurred in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, in the 1st and 2nd centuries. After all, why in Israel would you need to go away for 12 years, 24 years? It's a small country. Go home every once in a while. But they do reflect probably, to a certain extent, some of the anxieties and actual elements of Babylonian rabbinic learning. So that's one note, that these stories are not descriptions of history, but rather they're sort of morality tales, cautionary tales, reflections of the anxieties of the people who wrote them. And we can clearly see here that the anxiety the Babylonian rabbis are having is, how can one study Torah and at the same time live a family life? How can one be totally devoted to the study of Torah, so much so that one is a lover of Torah? One's heart is fully engaged, his passion, all of his energy, even I would go so far to say as his sexual energy, is completely devoted to Torah, and at the same time have their energy devoted to a wife, right? If we wanted to egalitarianize this, as we sometimes do, to a husband, or devoted to raising children, to earning a living, to worrying about the daily life. I can tell you as a father of 4 children that it is not easy to be completely dedicated to study, and I certainly don't think I am completely dedicated to study. At the same time, have all of these family issues, and have to be concerned about making a living. Those are very difficult issues. Now, one other issue about this set of Agadot. One thing that makes them very special is that it's not just one story. We have a cycle of 7 stories, some of which end in terrible tragedy when husbands are not there, do not return regularly to their wives. The first 2 stories end in death. The first story, the death of the In both first stories, the death of the husband. Later on, we read the death and the miraculous bringing back to life of the wife. Many of these stories lead to tragedy, but interestingly, they don't all lead to tragedy. We're going to see in the Rebbe Akiva and one other story that there are relatively successful endings. And I think that that's one thing that's special about the Agadah, is it shows the ambiguity of this matter. On the one hand, somebody who can successfully pull it off, who can fully devote their lives to Torah and yet have a spouse waiting for them when they come back, maybe that's the ideal. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next video. But it is not an ideal that can be pulled off by most people. In fact, it seems that only Rabbi Akiva, perhaps the greatest rabbi who ever lived, could have accomplished such a feat. But all other rabbis, including the readers of these stories, are probably being warned off. That is not a good idea. And indeed, despite the fact that the Rebbe Akiva story, which again we'll see next week, is an ideal in certain sectors of the Jewish world, we don't find modern rabbis, since the Middle Ages, we do not find rabbis going away for 10, 12, 24 years. Indeed, rabbis usually, when they're young, would go away for a little bit before they got married, but the custom came to be that once you were married, you did not absent yourself from your wife for a long time, perhaps based on the ideals of these stories.